Somewhere in the tangled, endlessly scrolling world of social media, a question was typed into an AI chatbot that most people assumed had already been answered 2,000 years ago, one way or another, depending entirely on what you believe. The question was simple. What actually happened to the body of Jesus of Nazareth after his crucifixion? The chatbot was Grok, the artificial intelligence system, built by Elon Musk's company XAI. Instead of giving a short, dismissive, or purely diplomatic non-answer, Grok laid out a detailed, methodical breakdown of every major historical, archaeological, and theological explanation for one of the most disputed disappearances in human history. Within hours, screenshots of the exchange were circulating across nearly every major platform. They were shared by believers who felt the AI had respectfully affirmed the resurrection, by skeptics who felt the AI had simply listed alternative theories without taking a side, and by a much larger group of people who were simply stunned that an AI chatbot was even willing to wade into a question this loaded in the first place. By the next morning, the internet was divided, arguing not just about Jesus, but about whether artificial intelligence has any business weighing in on questions of faith at all. In this video, we are going to walk through exactly what happened, what Grok actually said, the real historical and archaeological theories behind the empty tomb, and why this single AI conversation managed to reignite a debate that has been running quietly in the background of Western civilization for 2,000 years. To understand why this moment spread so quickly, you need to understand what makes the disappearance of Jesus' body such a genuinely unusual historical puzzle in the first place. Ancient executions under Roman rule were brutal, public, and almost always ended with the body of the condemned either left on the cross as a warning to others or discarded in a mass grave, denied the dignity of a proper burial entirely. Crucifixion was designed specifically to be humiliating even after death, and yet, according to all four canonical Gospels, along with early extra-biblical references from Jewish and Roman historians describing the broader Christian movement, Jesus was taken down from the cross relatively quickly and placed in an actual identifiable tomb, one owned by a wealthy follower named Joseph of Arimathea. 3 days later, according to the accounts, that tomb was found empty. No body, no dramatic escape witnessed by guards, just an empty stone chamber, a rolled-away boulder, and a group of women who arrived expecting to complete traditional burial rites, and instead found nothing where a body should have been. That basic sequence of events, a body placed in a known location and then simply gone, is what has kept historians, theologians, forensic investigators, and now apparently artificial intelligence systems arguing for 2 millennia. When Grok was asked directly what happened to the body, it did not simply default to a single explanation. Instead, according to widely shared accounts of the exchange, it walked through the primary competing theories one at a time, explaining the reasoning, the historical evidence, and the weaknesses behind each one, essentially behaving less like a chatbot handing down a verdict and more like a history professor summarizing an ongoing academic debate. This approach is precisely what triggered such wildly different reactions. Believers who wanted Grok to state plainly that the resurrection happened felt somewhat unsatisfied that the AI treated it as one hypothesis among several rather than a settled conclusion. Skeptics who wanted Grok to firmly declare the resurrection a myth or fabrication were equally unsatisfied because the AI never dismissed the possibility outright either, instead acknowledging that the empty tomb itself is a subject of significant historical debate and that different scholars evaluate the evidence in very different ways. Grok's AI answer frustrated absolutists on both sides precisely because it refused to hand either side a clean, uncomplicated victory. And that neutrality, in an era where so much online content is designed to confirm what people already believe, was apparently jarring enough to go viral all on its own. So let's actually walk through what those competing explanations are, because this is where the real historical substance of the story lies, far beyond the AI headline itself. The first and most obvious explanation, and the one that forms the foundation of Christian theology entirely, is the resurrection itself. The belief that Jesus physically rose from the dead 3 days after his crucifixion, appeared to his disciples on multiple occasions over a period of roughly 40 days according to the gospel accounts and the writings of Paul, and eventually ascended into heaven. For roughly 2 billion Christians worldwide today, this is not a theory to be debated. It is the central defining claim of their entire faith, the event upon which the legitimacy of Christianity itself rests. The Apostle Paul, writing decades before the Gospels were formally compiled, stated plainly that if the resurrection did not happen, the entire Christian faith would be meaningless. A remarkably blunt admission from one of the religion's founding figures that the resurrection was never treated as a minor detail, but as the load-bearing pillar of the entire belief system. The second major theory, one that has circulated since antiquity, is what historians often call the theft hypothesis. The idea that the disciples themselves removed the body from the tomb, either to fake a resurrection and keep the movement alive, or simply to give Jesus a more appropriate burial away from a borrowed tomb. This theory actually appears directly within the Gospel of Matthew itself, which describes Jewish authorities allegedly bribing Roman guards to spread a story, claiming the disciples stole the body while the guards slept. A detail scholars find fascinating precisely because it suggests that even in the earliest years after the crucifixion, this exact accusation was already circulating widely enough that early Christian writers felt the need to directly address and refute it in their own texts. Critics of the theft theory point out a significant historical problem, however, one that many scholars across religious and secular lines take seriously: the fact that nearly all of Jesus' original disciples reportedly went on to face persecution, imprisonment, and, according to most early church traditions, violent execution for continuing to preach that Jesus had risen. Historians generally find it difficult to establish that a group of people would willingly suffer torture and death for a lie they had fabricated and knew with absolute certainty to be false. However, the historical evidence for the exact circumstances of each apostle's death varies considerably, so this argument remains part of the broader debate, rather than definitive proof. A third theory, sometimes called the swoon theory, suggests that Jesus did not actually die on the cross at all, but instead lost consciousness from blood loss, exhaustion, and trauma. According to this theory, Roman soldiers and observers mistakenly believed him to be dead, and he was placed inside the cool, sealed tomb, before somehow reviving and finding the strength to move the massive stone blocking the entrance and walk out on his own. This theory has been extensively challenged by modern medical experts and forensic pathologists who have studied the physiological effects of Roman crucifixion. The process typically caused death through a combination of severe trauma, blood loss, respiratory failure, and cardiovascular collapse. Roman soldiers were also professionally trained executioners who were expected to confirm death before a body was released for burial. The Gospel of John famously describes a spear wound to Jesus' side, which Christian tradition interprets as an additional confirmation that he was already dead. A fourth theory proposes that the disciples and early followers simply went to the wrong tomb, confused in their grief, exhaustion, and unfamiliarity with a burial site that belonged to someone else entirely. Later, gospel writers could then have built an elaborate resurrection narrative around what was ultimately a simple case of mistaken location. Critics of this theory point out that the Jewish authorities, who had every motivation imaginable to disprove the resurrection story and end the growing Christian movement in its infancy, could simply have produced the actual body from the correct tomb to silence the controversy permanently. However, the historical record does not provide independent evidence that such a demonstration ever occurred. A fifth and more speculative theory, occasionally raised in academic discussions, though far less widely discussed than the others, suggests that the body may have been secretly relocated by Joseph of Arimathea himself or other sympathetic followers shortly after burial, potentially to protect it from desecration by hostile authorities, or possibly moved to a family tomb for more permanent burial once the initial hurried Sabbath Eve burial requirements had passed. This relocation could then have been unknown to the wider group of disciples before the tomb was discovered empty. Then there is the archaeological angle, the piece of this story that made international headlines decades before Grok ever existed and continues to fuel controversy today. In 1980, construction workers in the Talpiot neighborhood of Jerusalem accidentally broke into an ancient rock-cut tomb dating to the 1st century. It contained 10 limestone ossuaries, small boxes used in Jewish burial customs of the period to hold the bones of the deceased after the flesh had decomposed. Several of these ossuaries bore inscribed names that immediately caught the attention of archaeologists, including names that closely correspond to Jesus, Mary, Joseph, and several other figures associated with the family described in the New Testament. Decades later, in 2007, a documentary produced with significant promotional backing reignited global attention on the Talpiot tomb, controversially suggesting it might actually be the family burial site of Jesus himself, complete with his physical remains. A claim that would, if proven true, fundamentally contradict the entire concept of a bodily resurrection central to Christian theology. The vast majority of professional archaeologists and biblical scholars have pushed back against this interpretation, pointing out that names like Jesus, Joseph, and Mary were extraordinarily common among Jewish populations of that era, roughly comparable to how common certain names are in any culture today. Finding a cluster of familiar names in a first-century tomb therefore does not, by itself, establish that the tomb belonged to Jesus of Nazareth and his family. Still, the controversy never fully died down, and it resurfaces periodically whenever new documentaries, books, or now apparently AI-generated discussions bring renewed public attention back to the question of what physical evidence, if any, might still exist somewhere beneath the ancient stone of Jerusalem. Grok's willingness to methodically walk through theories like these rather than shutting the conversation down entirely or offering a purely diplomatic non-answer is precisely what set it apart from how many people expected an AI chatbot to handle a topic this sensitive. And that distinction connects directly back to how Elon Musk has publicly positioned Grok from its very launch, as a deliberately less restricted alternative to competing AI systems. Whether you view that philosophy as a genuine commitment to open inquiry, or as a calculated strategy to generate exactly the kind of viral, controversy-driven engagement that keeps an AI product in the headlines, the practical result in this specific case was an AI system willing to engage seriously and in detail with one of history's most emotionally loaded questions, rather than deflecting it with a generic disclaimer. What makes this entire episode so revealing, beyond the specific details of Jesus and the empty tomb, is what it exposes about the growing and genuinely uncharted relationship between artificial intelligence and questions of faith. For nearly all of recorded human history, questions this profound, questions about death, resurrection, meaning, and the supernatural, have been mediated almost exclusively through human institutions: priests, rabbis, imams, theologians, historians, and philosophers, each bringing centuries of accumulated tradition, training, and, crucially, a personal stake in the outcome. An AI chatbot has none of that. It has no faith, no fear of death, and no personal investment in whether the resurrection happened or not. It simply processes patterns across an enormous data set of human writing, including centuries of theological argument, historical scholarship, scientific analysis, and increasingly casual online debate. That fundamentally different starting point is exactly what makes AI responses to religious questions feel so strange to so many people. Simultaneously, more neutral in some ways because the system has no personal agenda, and less trustworthy in others because it lacks any genuine understanding of what these questions mean to the billions of people who have built their entire lives, communities, and identities around them. Reactions across religious communities have been notably mixed. Studying those reactions closely reveals a genuine unresolved tension that many religious leaders are only beginning to grapple with publicly. Some pastors, priests, and religious commentators have welcomed Grok's willingness to engage seriously with the historical evidence, arguing that an AI system honestly laying out competing theories and acknowledging the complexity of the historical record demonstrates that the resurrection question cannot simply be dismissed as an obvious fabrication. Others have expressed significant unease, arguing that treating the resurrection as one hypothesis on a list alongside relocation theories subtly flattens what, for billions of people, is not a historical puzzle to be casually debated, but the literal, non-negotiable foundation of their entire spiritual identity, reducing an act of profound faith to something resembling a true crime investigation working through suspects in a cold case. Skeptics and secular commentators, meanwhile, have raised a different but equally important concern, questioning why an AI system would present the resurrection as a serious historical possibility at all, given that it requires accepting a supernatural event with no direct, independently verifiable physical evidence beyond ancient religious texts written by individuals connected to the movement itself. Critics in this camp argue that Grok's even-handed treatment of a supernatural explanation alongside secular historical theories risks lending artificial credibility to religious claims simply by including them in a numbered list of possibilities. A framing choice that can subtly shape how casual users perceive the relative plausibility of ideas that professional historians and scientists would typically categorize very differently, some as historical hypotheses, and others as matters of faith that fall outside the domain of empirical verification. This tension between presenting information neutrally and inadvertently shaping public perception, simply through the act of choosing how to frame competing ideas, sits at the heart of a much larger conversation currently unfolding across the entire AI industry, one that extends far beyond questions about Jesus specifically. As millions of people increasingly turn to AI chatbots not just for coding help or trip planning, but for genuine answers to history's biggest and most contested questions, the framing choices these systems make, which theories to mention first, which language to use, and how much weight to implicitly assign to competing explanations, carry enormous and largely unexamined influence over public understanding. A textbook goes through editorial review, academic peer review, and institutional oversight before reaching students. A documentary credits its sources and discloses its funding. An AI chatbot response, by contrast, can be generated in seconds, shaped by training data whose exact composition remains largely opaque even to the companies that built the systems, and delivered with the same confident, authoritative tone regardless of whether the underlying question has a solid evidence-based answer or remains genuinely and permanently unresolvable. Historians who study the intersection of religion and emerging technology have pointed out that this is far from the first time a new communication medium has reshaped how the resurrection story gets told and received. The printing press, centuries ago, dramatically expanded access to biblical texts, once tightly controlled by religious institutions, fueling the Protestant Reformation and permanently altering the balance of religious authority across Europe. Radio and television in the 20th century transformed sermons into mass broadcast events reaching millions simultaneously, and giving rise to entirely new categories of religious media personalities and televised ministries. The internet further fragmented and democratized religious discourse, allowing countless competing interpretations, denominations, and skeptical counterarguments to coexist and clash in the same digital spaces. Artificial intelligence may represent simply the newest chapter in that same long-running story, a new lens through which one of history's oldest and most consequential questions continues to be examined, debated, and reframed for each new generation using whatever tools that generation happens to have access to. What ultimately makes the Grok controversy so compelling is not that it settled anything, because it